The wind bites like a promise. Trees stand like skeletons against a low gray sky. Footsteps vanish into a white hush that swallows sound and time. In the places where winter digs its teeth in, stories gather at the edge of the firelight, and one of them keeps returning: the Wendigo. A gaunt hunger, a whisper that turns neighbors into nightmares, a warning thrown up against desperate nights. Some call it a monster, some call it a lesson. Tonight, we walk that line between myth and meaning and try to figure out what, exactly, we name when we say Wendigo. Case file. These are the facts on record. The Wendigo is a figure found across multiple Algonquian-speaking cultures in North America. Names and descriptions shift from place to place, but several motifs recur: winter, cold, and famine, an appalling thinness or endless hunger, a connection in some accounts to cannibalism or the breakdown of social taboos. Crucially, these belong first and foremost to oral traditions, stories told aloud by elders taught at camps, woven into ceremonies and moral instruction long before any outsider wrote them down. Later, explorers, traders, missionaries, and anthropologists recorded versions of these tales. Their notes and translations helped carry the Wendigo into the written world, but also changed how people outside those communities understood it. A short story you might hear at a lakeside fire. An elder leans forward and speaks softly of a hunter who refused to share his last store of meat. The man grew thin and greedy at night. He heard scraping at the cabin wall. The next morning there was another hunger where the hunter had been. So the tale goes. The man had become something else, a warning given the sharp edges of a lesson. That kind of tale functions on several levels: spiritual, social, psychological, not merely to frighten, but to teach, share, keep kin close. Do not let scarcity hollow you out. Timeline: for generations, the Wendigo lived in the mouths of storytellers and the minds of listeners. Those oral teachings shaped behavior during the lean months and carried spiritual meanings about balance, respect, and the danger of isolating greed. At points of sustained contact, outsiders recorded these stories. Their accounts arrived stamped with disbelief, curiosity, religious assumptions, or scientific frameworks. From that moment, the story forks. Written descriptions sometimes emphasize physical monstrosity. Other times, observers treated the Wendigo as evidence of strange mental illness or used it to explain crimes. In the 20th century, popular culture began to borrow and reshape elements: a gaunt, towering creature in a movie, a psychological monster in a novel, a survival horror antagonist in a game. Each retelling drew from the old stories but also remade them, and in the remaking, the Wendigo grew new teeth. Controversies. When we try to explain what the Wendigo is, we find competing interpretations, each with its own evidence and limits. One explanation: the Wendigo is a literal supernatural being in indigenous cosmologies. Supporting this view are the many community stories that frame the Wendigo as spirit or being with agency, stories embedded in ritual, moral teaching, and spiritual practice. Those narratives are not casual fictions. They carry weight, context, and authority within the cultures that tell them. The skeptical counterpoint is methodological. Supernatural claims resist empirical testing by the methods of science. To scientists, the claim that the Wendigo literally walks the woods would require verifiable, repeatable phenomena assessed under controlled conditions, or else testimony accepted as authoritative by the cultural communities themselves. In practice, the boundaries lie in cultural trust and interpretive frameworks. What counts as evidence inside a living tradition need not translate to scientific proof. Second explanation: the Wendigo functions as cultural allegory or social control. Many versions of the tale appear in contexts that warn against greed, selfishness, and breaking communal norms. In hard winters, when food ran short, stories about the Wendigo could be a way to enforce sharing, to discourage hoarding, or to explain why certain taboos exist. This explanation is persuasive because it links narrative to behavior. Folklore, in that sense, is practical. The counterpoint is not easily dismissed. Not every telling is reducible to a moral parable. Stories are layered. They contain spiritual cosmology, emotional truth, historical memory, and local nuance that resist being flattened into just a warning. Third explanation tries to locate the Wendigo in psychological or psychiatric experience. Historical accounts from colonial records sometimes describe people who, in episodes of extreme isolation, starvation, or mental distress, expressed fears of becoming a Wendigo or even committed acts of violence, interpreted as Wendigo-related. Scholars have proposed controversially that some of these accounts reflect culture-bound syndromes or psychoses shaped by context. The problems here are multiple. Early reports were often written by outsiders with limited understanding, and the temptation to retroactively diagnose complex cultural expressions with modern psychiatric labels can erase the social and spiritual dimensions of those expressions. Rigorous, ethical clinical study, conducted with the consent and collaboration of communities, would be needed to understand whether there are recurring psychological phenomena behind the stories. Fourth explanation focuses on modern media. Over the past century, writers, filmmakers, and game designers have borrowed Wendigo elements and amplified them. Those fictional Wendigos often become standardized, tall, emaciated, feral, and that image feeds back into public perception of what the Wendigo is. The influence works both ways. Creators draw on traditional themes, and audiences then read the traditional material through the lens supplied by fiction. Tracing the path of influence requires close work, line-by-line comparisons, interviews with creators, and studies of audience reception. So what would count for or against these explanations? For the supernatural claim, proof would be the kinds of things religious communities accept as proof, consistent living testimony and practice that continues to name and work with the spirit in question. For the allegory claim, evidence would be widespread, consistent uses of the figure in context that clearly aim to shape social behavior. For the psychiatric hypothesis, careful culturally informed clinical studies would be necessary. For media impact, the evidence would be clear lines from traditional motifs into modern texts, and observable shifts in how people outside those cultures talk about the Wendigo. Reality check. Here are the firm anchors we can rely on. Verified, the Wendigo appears across Algonquian oral traditions. Motifs of hunger, winter, and taboo breaking are common in many, though not all accounts. Oral tradition predates written records, and written and popular culture have shaped public images of the Wendigo. Unverified claims include specific allegations that assign historical crimes to supernatural possession, unless those claims are corroborated by primary legal or community sources. Similarly, claims that a distinct psychiatric disorder called Wendigo psychosis exists as a discrete, universally recognized diagnosis are debated and not settled. Most plausible synthesis. The Wendigo operates as a flexible cultural figure. It can be a spirit, a moral lesson, or a label for extreme psychological experiences, or all three, depending on time, place, and who is telling the story. There is human logic in that flexibility. In harsh climates, hunger is not merely physical. It sits next to shame, fear, and the terror of losing kin. A story that personifies insatiable appetite does useful work, giving shape to an otherwise anonymous danger, naming the impulse to hoard, to turn on others. At the same time, stories have power. When a tale crosses languages and centuries and ends up on a movie screen, it courts simplification. The emotional force remains horror, dread, sympathy, but the cultural specificity often thins. We should also name the cost of reshaping. When popular media strips context, it can erase the communities for whom the Wendigo is more than an aesthetic. That erasure is not merely academic. It influences how outsiders engage with those cultures, and it can make it harder to recognize the original teachings about responsibility, reciprocity, and restraint. Conversely, sensitive adaptations can bring attention to the source material and create openings for dialogue. The line between appropriation and amplification is negotiated through respect, credit, and listening. What about those old psychiatric claims? The historical reports that mention Wendigo psychosis come from a period when scholarship often sought singular diagnoses for diverse human experiences. Hunger, isolation, trauma, and cultural expectation can produce terrifying behavior or delusions, but labeling those varied experiences with a single catch-all risks, flattening the lived realities of individuals and communities into clinical shorthand. If any contemporary research is to proceed, it must do so with ethical rigor and the involvement of indigenous scholars and elders, so that clinical categories do not overwrite cultural meanings. If you felt a chill listening, the little hitch in your breath when the wind and the hunger were named, you are now part of the story. That is what folklore does. It holds a mirror and shows what a culture fears, what it teaches to guard against. The Wendigo tells us about scarcity and selfishness, about what happens when social bonds fray. It tells us as well about how stories travel and change. It warns us about the human cost of forgetting context when we retell. So what is the Wendigo? A monster at the edge of the wood, a name for dark impulse and hunger, a cautionary tale about sharing and care. A label sometimes used carefully or carelessly. In psychiatric literature, a borrowing for entertainment. All these answers can be accurate at once, so long as we remember to ask which Wendigo we mean and whose telling we respect. If this held your curiosity, do two things for us. Like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world. Then tell us in the comments, what does the Wendigo mean to you? Is it a creature, a lesson, a symptom, or a story we keep to shore up community during hard times? Your perspective helps keep the conversation alive. Thank you for listening.